Hello, my name is Professor Hugh Blair. I'm from Massey University in Palmerston North, New Zealand, and I'm also part of the International Sheep Research Centre. What I'm going to talk about today is using genetics to improve sheep farm profitability. The first thing I want to show you here is that we can get genetic improvement that is a change in looks. So I've looked here at the Romney breed, which is one of the predominant breeds in New Zealand. This is what it used to look like in the 1800s. By the time we got through to 1920 and 1930, breeders had changed it significantly. You can see some of the changes are pretty obvious as far as the wool type is concerned, and also the wool has been selected to come down the face, and also the wool has been selected to come down the legs. In the original breed, there was no wool on the legs, no wool on the face. By the time we got through to the 2000s, farmers had decided that this sort of animal was no longer appropriate, and they had again removed the wool from the face, so the nose was now exposed, and that also removed the wool from the legs. Now this is more about what the animal looks like rather than what is important, and that is changing traits that affect the profitability of the farm. So what is plotted in this graph here is the weaning weight. This is the breeding value for weaning weight on this scale, and this is time across here from 2000 through to 2009. And what we can see here is that in this particular flock, which is one of our major farmers in New Zealand, we can see that the breeding value or the genetic value for weaning weight is improving as we go through time. Weaning weight is going to be directly related to the profitability of the farm. So it's nice to see this change in a positive direction. And this is the power of genetics. Before I go on though, I just need to do a brief description of what the New Zealand sheep farming system looks like. And I'm going to look at it from a numbers point of view. All the way through this talk, I'm going to divide our farms into commercial farms and into nucleus farms. And the nucleus farms are responsible for breeding the rams, whereas the commercial farms are responsible for producing the meat and the wool. The total number of farms in New Zealand, sheep farms in New Zealand, is around about 13,000. The total number of ewes on those farms is around about 22 million. We don't know exactly how many rams they use each year, hence I've put a question mark, but probably about 300,000 rams per year, and from that combination we're selling about 20 million lambs for slaughter for meat production. When we look at the ram breeding flocks, it's a much smaller number. We don't know the exact number, but it's probably around about 600. The number of ewes that are involved are probably about 600,000. Around about 20,000 rams are used across those 600,000 ewes. And we have about 100,000 rams that will be sold up into here, remembering that these rams will be used on average for 2 to 3 years. So each year we only need to bring through about 100,000 rams. The important point here is that all of the genetic gain in the sheep industry is generated by these farmers down here. So these 600 farmers that are causing the genetic gain in the sheep industry in New Zealand are directly responsible for what is happening in these 13,000 farms. The genetic gain is made here, and the genetic gain is exported to the commercial farmers. So what I want to look at in this talk is what is needed to improve the profit by using better genetics on these farms. First of all, if we look at the nucleus breeders, so as I said before, these are also called the ram breeders or seed stock producers. What they have to do is that they have to measure something they have to record it, and from that information they have to choose the best parents, and I'll come back to best parents in a moment. They have to choose the best parents, and then they sell either the rams or the semen from those best parents. So remember, that's the nucleus breeders. When we look at the commercial breeders, or the commercial farmers, what they have to do is they have to buy the best rams from the nucleus breeders. They mate the best parents. Of course, they manage the flock. And the most important thing is that they sell meat and wool at a greater profit if they are buying the best rams from the ram breeders. So those are the processes that we've got. There's a couple of important questions or challenges to be answered from that very simple representation. The first thing is that we have to define what do we mean by best. I said that the nucleus flocks had to mate the best parents. What does that actually mean? Also, what are the traits that we should measure and record? It's very easy to say we should measure and record, but which traits should we measure and record? And then finally, we also have to look at best. We looked at best up here in the ram breeding flocks. We also have to decide what is best in our commercial flocks. So we've got these things to consider over the remainder of the talk. So first of all, what do we mean by what is best in our nucleus or ram breeding flocks? Best should be a reflection of the profit in the commercial farms. Now remember, I'm talking about the ram breeders here. We're not talking about profit on the ram breeding farm. We're talking about profit on the commercial farm. And that profit is going to be a function of two things, the revenue and the costs. The revenue will be made up of a number of things, and I've just put three here: the number of lambs sold, the weight of the meat and the wool sold, and the quality of the meat and the wool sold. So those are all the things that affect income. And then we will have a number of things that affect costs, but I've just put up the feed costs and animal health costs. These are the things that we have to take into account to decide what is best in the nucleus flock. Once we've decided what is best, we can put that into what we call a breeding objective. What is the purpose of breeding? What is the objective of breeding based on those traits that we've just shown have affected the profit on the commercial farm? Once we've decided what that breeding objective is, which will be a list of traits, and we'll see that in a moment, we then have to apportion the selection pressure that we can bring to bear on those traits. So we have to share the selection pressure amongst the traits, and we should do that objectively. The way we do it objectively is that we need to define an economic value for each of those goal traits. Each of those traits that is affecting profitability, we should work out what is it worth to the commercial farmer, what is its economic value. Importantly, because we're breeding for the commercial farmers in the future, somewhere about 6 years into the future, we don't use the values of those traits today. We have to think about what the value of those traits will be in 6 years' time. The other thing that we have to do, so here we're choosing how to apportion our selection pressure. The other thing we have to do is that we have to measure and record some phenotypes, but we must change those phenotypes into breeding values. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So these are the two primary issues that we have once we've decided what the breeding objective is for the farm. And here is the way in which we combine our information so that we can get a single genetic value for each animal. Even though we might be breeding for a large number of traits, as I'll explain in a moment, by adding them all together, we can just get a single genetic value for each animal. So here's an example. What we might take is that here is the breeding value, so each of these BVs refers to a breeding value. This particular one here refers to weaning weight, and the figure out the front is the economic value for weaning weight. In this particular case, 136 cents. The weaning weight maternal, so this is the milking ability of the mother, is weighted by 121 cents. The carcass weight, 374 cents. And look at this one here. This is important to recognize that our economic values can be negative. This value here is negative 149. Why is it negative? This is the breeding value for ewe live weight. As we'll know, the heavier a ewe is, the more she will eat, and therefore the greater of the cost of that maternal body weight. What this is reflecting is that the feed costs to do with that ewe are going to affect the income negatively, so they're a cost in the system, and so it should be negative. Here's another negative value down here, a negative economic value, minus 4 cents for each unit of fecal egg count. So this, if we add all these together, we end up with a single genetic value for each animal, which I'll show you in a moment. The way in which this is done in New Zealand is that we have a company called Sheep Improvement Limited. So Sheep Improvement Limited operates on behalf of all the sheep farmers in New Zealand, and it is funded by a levy from all of those sheep farmers in New Zealand. What happens is that the nucleus breeders collect their data and they send their data to Sheep Improvement Limited. SIL, or Sheep Improvement Limited, has software, and what that software will do is it will adjust the data. We won't deal with what it adjusts for, but we can talk about that later if you wish. And it converts the data into breeding values and then subsequently into a single index for each animal. So that happens inside the software that is provided by Sheep Improvement Limited. This will enable the genetic ranking of all of the animals for a particular farm, and those are returned as a list, which we'll see in a minute, to each of the breeders. Where we have genetic linkages existing between flocks, we can, in fact, compare the breeding values and the indices across those flocks. All right, just remind you again, if flocks are genetically linked, so if they share most likely rams or possibly ewes, but more likely if they share rams, there are going to be genetic linkages between them, and that enables us to compare the breeding values across flocks. If there's no genetic linkage between flocks, we cannot compare the breeding values. We have to select within that flock. The way in which this is done in Sheep Improvement Limited system is SIL, Sheep Improvement Limited, as we have up here, and they have a system called SIL-ACE where you can compare those breeding values. Now this is the title page for a sire summary, so there is clearly too much information on here for me to show you the whole lot. But the important thing is that it tells you which flock, it tells you what year it is, tells you here what the traits are that are involved in the index, but I'm not going to deal with them in any detail. Also, the second page has also got too much detail, but I'll focus in on this in a moment. But this is what a page of sire information looks like. So each one of these lines running across here is all of the information about a particular sire. And the information is contained in each line for us to make a decision about whether we should be using that ram for breeding or not. So let's focus in on this a little bit. So what I've done here is that I've just taken the first 10 animals looking at the sire index values. So let's just go back to the page. What I'm looking at here is that this column here with the ADP, this is the dual purpose index. So I'm looking at these numbers here. Alongside it, we've got the sire identification number, and over here we've got the ranking of the animals 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, all the way through to the list of, I think, 200 in this particular case. So what I'm looking at here is the sire identification just for the first 10 animals. Here is the genetic index for each of those sires, and here is the rank going from 1 to 10. The sire ID contains the individual sire number, and the slash, the number following the slash, is the year of birth of that particular ram. So ram number 417 was born in 2008, 2009, and so on. So what we have here is the genetic ranking of the animal. Because our economic values are recorded in cents, the economic ranking is in cents. So this is 3,228 New Zealand cents for the top animal, and the 10th animal is 2,754. What does that mean? What do these values mean? If we look over this side here, if we take the difference between these two values, the difference is 474 cents. Now, not all of that turns up in the offspring. Only half of the genetics go from the sire to their offspring. And so if we want to look at the advantage in 1,000 offspring, we can see that it is a half of this cost. It's not 1,000 times 474, which would be $4,740. It's half of that value at 2,370. So we take half of this value turns up in each of the offspring. So if we take the difference between these two values, animal number 1 and animal number 10, we get the difference of 470, and this is what turns up in the offspring. Now, that might not sound like a terribly large amount of money, but if we accumulate that over a 10-year period, it does become a significant amount of money. And of course, I'm only looking at the difference between the first ram and the 10th ram. If we looked at the difference between the first ram and the 200th ram or the 500th ram, this difference would of course be much bigger. But this is just giving you an idea of how we use this material. On the far right-hand side, so let's just go back, on the far right-hand side of the table, you can see a list of breeds. And if we look in amongst the breeds, we can see that we have a Coopworth, which is in New Zealand, was produced in the 1960s by crossing a Romney with a Border Leicester and then interbreeding to get the Coopworth. We have a Texel East Frisian Romney. There are 4 of them in the top 10. We have another Coopworth, we have a Romney and another Coopworth. So what's important there is that crossbred animals in New Zealand are making a significant contribution in terms of the economic gain in our industry. In fact, there's only one what we would call purebred, the Romney, coming from the late 1800s in New Zealand, with the Coopworth being a composite breed and the Tefrom being a new composite breed formed just in the last decade. The next issue, or the next challenge that we have to address, is what are we going to measure and record? Well, in fact, there are a limited number of things that are easy to record and measure when we're looking at sheep. We can, of course, weigh the animals, so we might weigh the animals as lambs, or we might weigh them 1-year-old or when they're mature animals. So that's fairly straightforward. We can also count the number of offspring they have. It seems easy, but it can be challenging, especially when we have 3 or 4 lambs turning up for each ewe, and maybe 10 ewes lambed overnight, and there are 30 lambs and there are 10 ewes. How do we get the right number of lambs with the right ewes? We can weigh the fleece. That's also reasonably straightforward. We can look at carcass characteristics, but that's a bit more difficult because we have to kill some animals to be able to get at those carcass quality traits. There are ways of doing that, but it is not as straightforward as weighing the animal or counting the number of offspring. We can also look at disease traits. This disease here that we're seeing is called facial eczema. It's caused by the ingestion of a fungus which has a toxin associated with it, causes liver damage, and it causes photosensitivity, so the skin becomes broken, and it is typically the animal will simply be very irritated, which will cause it to lose body condition. In the worst case scenario, it may cause death, but it doesn't necessarily cause death in all animals. Another health trait is we can see over here worms inside the intestine. Well, again, we have to kill the animal if we're going to count the worms, and an alternative is that we can take the fecal egg count. So here are a number of things that we can measure on the animal itself, but there are not too many other things that we can do. In the new world that is coming about over the last 5 or 6 years, we might also consider using molecular genetics. So this example here is a slide of the sheep or ovine snip chip, the 50,000, so the 50,000 snip chip. So there are 50,000 SNPs on this particular slide, which might enable us to associate variants in the DNA with wool, or variants with live weight, variants with facial eczema susceptibility, and so on. But this is still a relatively new technology, and it is not yet in widespread use. I have no doubt in the future it will be. Right, so that's what we had as best for the ram breeders or the commercial breeders. What we now need to think of is what is best in terms of the parents as far as the commercial farmer is concerned. Well, the first question that the commercial farmer has to address is what breed should they be using in their particular environment. You ask the question, are we getting any benefit as far as hybrid vigour is concerned, or as far as complementarity is concerned? Maybe an example of complementarity is that we might want to use the fast growth rates of a breed like a Suffolk to be incorporated into a maternal breed. And of course that will give us some hybrid vigour as well. Once we've decided which breed or which breeds we're going to use, we should then decide which breeder are we going to choose our rams from. When we're deciding which breeder to use, we need to know some things about what they're doing. We need to know what is their breeding objective, as I talked before. So the commercial farmer needs to ask the ram breeder, what are they breeding for? You should not just leave this question up to the ram breeder. You should know what the ram breeder is doing when you are buying rams from him or her. Of course, that will dictate then the rate of genetic gain. Again, as a commercial farmer making an important economic decision, you should ask the ram breeder to demonstrate to you that they are making genetic gain in the traits that are relevant to your farming situation. Ask them to demonstrate that they are making genetic gain. They should be able to show you a graph using the Sheep Improvement Limited system, showing you how much gain they are making in the traits that are relevant for your farm. An alternative to that, and some good backup information, is using comparative trials. And there are a number of comparisons running in New Zealand at the moment, showing rams from different flocks, from different ram breeders in New Zealand, and showing you the comparative genetics between those different breeds and between those different flocks. So we've decided on the breed or breeds, we've decided on the breeder, and the final step is to decide on which rams are you going to buy from that breeder. And of course what I would hope that you would do is that you would select those rams based on the genetic merit that was in that table that I showed you just a few moments ago. Look at the index value for the traits that are relevant for your system. Now, you won't always be able to buy the rams that are at the top end, because some of those rams will be very expensive. They might be $10,000, and that is probably too much for a commercial farmer to pay. You will need to look at what benefit that you're generating or gaining from buying that particular ram or set of rams. And you can do that. I showed you how to do those calculations just a few moments ago. So you should look at the cost of the ram and look at the benefits, the economic benefits that you're going to get on your particular farm. So, having said all that, it's a good question to ask. In New Zealand, are we actually seeing any genetic improvement in these traits? And the answer to that is definitely yes. And we have some very well organised ram breeders who are using Sheep Improvement Limited system to manipulate their data, to come up with breeding values, to combine those into indices, rank the rams so that you can then select the best rams. And I've just put up the logos for a number of the farms are available in New Zealand. These are not all of them, of course, just some of the bigger breeders, including the One Stop Ram Shop. Now here is a trend line. I'm going to show you some trend lines for traits in New Zealand. So this value here is the ewe lambing percentage, and across the bottom we've got from 1990-91 through to about 2011. And so you can see we started out at around about 100%. There are some ups and downs through here, but overall we've got a trend line running through here where we're getting somewhere around about 19 percentage points in the number of lambs per ewe. You can see it out here in 2010, 2011. We had a big problem because we had some very severe storms at the time of lambing, and so we dropped from 123 down to 111. So we can see a dramatic effect of the environment. This trend line here is now lamb kilograms per breeding ewe, starting out in 1990 at about 10 kilos. Pretty poor. We certainly wouldn't expect that performance today, and over time through to 2010, 2011, this has now come out to about 18 kilos of carcass weight. So a very good trend line running through there. So if we look, these are slightly different figures now, 1994 to 2007, but if we look at the total gain between those two periods for carcass weight and for lambing percentage, carcass weight has gone up by 2.5 kilos, lambing percentage has gone up by 16.3. What I'm really interested in is saying, what was the genetic contribution to that phenotypic trend? Because contained in there is also better feeding and better management. We only want to look at the genetic. And what our figures show us is that a little bit over half of the carcass weight was generated by improved genetics, and about a third of the improved lambing percentage, 5% out of the 16, was generated by genetics. So I think we can say pretty comprehensively that we are seeing genetic improvement in some important economic traits in the New Zealand sheep industry. But, there's always a but. But we could do better. We could do better by having better definition of our breeding objective. Not all farmers, not all ram breeders in New Zealand have got a well-defined breeding objective. What are the traits that they are actually aiming to improve? They should be written down, and we should have weighting factors saying how important are those traits. How important is number of lambs born? How important is lamb survival? How important is carcass weight? Also, we could have better use of selection intensity. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when we cull animals, when we cull rams or when we select rams, we should make sure we're selecting on the basis of our objective. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes the farmers throw out a ram or throw out some ewes because they don't like the look of them. Does that really affect the profit of the farm? Every time we do that, we're wasting some selection pressure. And finally, we could do with some better education of our ram buyers. So the commercial farmers who are buying the rams, we could do a better job of educating them on how to use the lists that I just showed you a few moments ago. And if we did that, we would be able to make even better genetic gain in the New Zealand sheep industry. Thank you very much for your attention.